I had been sent to Korea from my university a few years ago. They told me for my major I had to go somewhere in Asia, and my friend had really talked up Korea for me. I knew nothing about it, but I decided what the hell and embarked on a semester-long trip. I had only one serious boyfriend in my life, who I had broken up with a few months prior. I also don't enjoy one-night stands and wasn't digging the dudes at the clubs in Seoul, but I still wanted to have some sort of romantic experience. So my friend recommended I use this dating app to meet English-speaking Koreans. That way, I could meet someone and experience the actual dating culture. I thought, I'm young, why not? I was just so eager to have the new experience. Maybe it sounds dumb to try dating in a foreign country, but it worked out for me eventually. Just not the first date. I met him on a dating app after being in Seoul for 3 weeks. We'll call him Tim. I still didn't know the culture or city very well, and was a bit naive about everything. He eagerly wanted to meet for a date after talking to me, and he seemed nice. I should have asked more questions, and I should have noticed that he was not giving me many details about himself. Tim was a guy a little older than me, but claimed he was a college student. I assumed he had done his military time, which all men in Korea have to do, and returned to school. We talked for a bit and decided to meet for a tea date near the school I went to. He wanted to come to my dorm originally to pick me up, but I live in an all-women's dorm and didn't want him to know exactly where I lived since we were still strangers. So instead, I insisted we meet at the main town center near the subway. He really didn't like this idea, which, looking back, was a red flag. But eventually I insisted. The night of the date, I waited an hour for this guy. He was very late. Tim weirdly claimed he just wanted to make me wait. I thought he was kidding and messaged him a laughing emoji, assuming he was just lost. When he finally arrived, he was much smaller than I thought, but a man's height has never been something I care about much. He was also quite thin. Maybe I let my guard down because I didn't see him as physically threatening to me, which was a mistake in the end. Right off the bat, he was way too touchy with me and breathed creepy and heavy. I was so put off by his demeanor. I'm usually very tolerant with different personality types, but this was very odd to me. I had been told that Korean men would be polite and not so touchy on the first date. He was also dressed oddly like in business attire for a date, but I thought that maybe it was just a Korean thing. The first thing he said to me was, "You're not as white as I thought you were." I thought this was a translation error, that his English was near perfect, so I asked for clarification, and he said what he meant. "I thought you would be more white. Your skin is darker, and your eyes aren't green. Are you pure European?" Now I was officially weirded out. First of all, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. I'm Irish and Scandinavian, so white as hell basically. So the fact he thought I could have possibly been any whiter was funny. And why did he care in the first place anyway? Why does my skin color matter to this guy? And why is he bringing it up? He said it about 3 times on the date, how he wished I had greener eyes, and every time I would just reply, "Well, maybe my online photos make me look brighter," and brushed it off as him being nervous and trying to start a conversation. Isn't it funny the dumb excuses you make for people when you're panicked? When we arrived at the tea place, I tried to order a basic raspberry tea, and he stopped me and told me I had to have this specialty. I thought it was weird he wanted to choose my tea for me, but in my head I brushed it off once again. He really insisted I drink only this type of tea, and I just agreed. These small details become weirder later. After tea, he asked if we could look around my school. It was dark, but the school is very well lit, so I agreed. And the whole time we walked around, he would randomly stop and grab me for long hugs. At first, I let it happen, but then I stopped him, and he continued trying. He kept grabbing me and breathing hard into my neck. It was so awkward. He also wouldn't tell me any personal details about himself. I asked so many questions, desperately trying to distract from all the awkward grabbing, and to try and get to know him. But he would never tell me anything. He even said at one point, "I'm a mysterious man," like a movie line. He also said something like, "You look so much like my favorite movie character." I asked him who that would be, but he said that I would need to figure it out on my own. Finally, he said, "I want to go to a dark area." And in my head, I screamed, "Hell no." At this point, I wanted the date to be over fast. He somehow knew there was a wooded area behind my campus, and he said that we should go there. I said no, and that I wanted to stay near the main campus in town, but he kept pushing. Finally, he grabbed my arm and started dragging me there. He said, "I can't let anyone see," and I started to panic. I finally ripped my arm away and just demanded we leave and go back to the main road immediately. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't ask for help or get angry. Maybe I was scared, but I just began to book it back to the main road, and he followed. We ended up in front of a hospital near the town center, and I told him it was time for him to go. I made some excuse, and he was pleading with me to stay. I told him, and lied, that we could meet the next day, and that I would message him. I just wanted to get away at this point. I was pretending everything was fine in order for him to go. Suddenly, I think he's leaning in to kiss me, and I immediately think, "Oh God, no," but it was so much worse. Instead, I feel pain in my face. It takes me a second to realize he was biting my face. It was like a dog. I had never felt the sensation before. He leaned his head sideways and bit me on my nose and cheek as hard as he could. I screamed and pushed him away. His face looked so freaky. I barely had any time to react in words. Instead, I ran up the sidewalk until I saw a convenience store on the right, ran into the back of the store, and bent down and started to cry. The man who owned the store started to yell at me, but I couldn't explain my situation. I just begged him in English to let me stay, and I ended up having to buy a popsicle to stick around. God, I wish I had learned some Korean by then. I guess Tim didn't follow me. I appeared outside the store and didn't see him. I texted a friend and waited for them to get me to take me back to my dorm. On the way, I messaged Tim and basically told him to stay away from me. I told him he was a creep and that he shouldn't bite women, and something along the lines of me calling the police, and then blocked him. I was so scared to walk around my school area after that. I was so afraid he would find me somehow, and I'm so thankful I never let him pick me up at my dorm. I called my mum to tell her what happened, when suddenly she said, "Wait, what did he ask you?" She then put some details together and realized all of these weird things had to do with the 50 Shades of Grey books. At first I thought she was just being silly and overthinking a bad date. I thought she was joking. But oh god, she was right. She'd recently seen the movie or read the book. The eye color, the way he dressed, and the tea he made me drink, and the random lines he said, it all matched the books and movies for his dirty little fantasy. My mum thinks he picked me because I looked like the girl from the movie to him. It explains why he was so fixated on my appearance and his whole thing with the biting and trying to dominate me. Even if it wasn't his intention, I later learned that there are a few creeps who seek out foreign girls to dominate and sleep with as a prize. They call it riding the white horse, or something along those lines. On a happier note, this bad experience didn't stop me. I eventually met someone else in Korea, and we ended up falling in love. We even did the whole long distance thing, and now I'm living in Korea studying and working, hoping to marry soon. So I guess I didn't let bad creepy guys stop my life. As for Tim, let's not meet. It's been years, but I will still kick your ass if I see you, and I won't have to bite. I worked at a local government agency for a long time. Each summer, we would get a crop of new interns. Most were fine, some caused issues, like when we caught 2 of them making out in the fire room. But overall, they were just normal kids from high school or college trying to get some work experience. In 2016, my department received an intern later than usual, right in the middle of summer. Warner was a bit older than the usual crowd, around my age, maybe late 20s. We initially hit it off pretty well, and although I found him sort of strange, I didn't mind since he was friendly and we had some common interests. He was the only person in my department who was even close to my age. The interns were all teenagers, and the regular staff averaged around 60, older than my mum. I was psyched to have a peer to chat to, so occasionally I would eat lunch with Warner or stop to talk at his cubicle. His strangeness was mostly an outsized personality, a mix of over-the-top enthusiasm with a bit of social awkwardness, and I got zero bad vibes from the guy. It wasn't before long that Warner started having major performance problems at work. He would produce little to no work on most days, no show or arrive late without informing anyone, and generally acted unprofessionally. One day, he showed up for work at 3:15 p.m. when our workday ended at 4:30. The office manager was livid and told him to go home. His behavior bothered nearly everyone in my office, but I did not supervise him, and we had plenty of slack interns in the past. While his antics were a bit of a spectacle, it wasn't a big deal to me. If you're wondering why he wasn't let go, 2 words: political favor. I found out from Warner himself that he was hired because his uncle donated to the campaign of our big boss. He wasn't going anywhere. Near the end of that summer, I put in my notice that I was leaving my job and relocated to a new state. Once Warner caught wind of this, he would constantly complain that it sucked I was leaving because we had barely any time to become friends. I would always laugh lightly in response and give a sympathetic, "yeah." He would start to monopolize my time at work more and more, and it became disruptive to the people who sat near me. I found it slightly annoying, but I was also extremely happy to be leaving that job for reasons unrelated to Warner, and I spent my last month there not caring much about what my co-workers thought. I tolerated him lingering by my desk. One day, he caught me leaving work and offered me a ride home. I usually took the bus, and occasionally other co-workers would offer me rides home if they were going my way, so this didn't seem odd to me. I accepted and walked to his car with him. It smelled awful and was full of garbage. He hastily cleared off the passenger seat and apologized. We got on our way, but once we were on the main road, he started begging me to stop and get dinner with him. I laughed and said he didn't need to ask me that insistently, and said that we could stop at a diner on the way. We had a nice meal with pleasant conversation. He was intelligent and had a variety of interests. Our political positions aligned, and we shared disdain for our cranky old co-workers. I had a good time. I expressed he didn't need to drive me all the way home, now that it was late, but he kept insisting, so I relented. As I directed him towards my house, he started in again with the whining about how our developing friendship was cut short because of my move. At this point, I was tired of hearing this. The decision to leave my job and move away from home was extremely difficult to make, and I was proud of how bold I was being. I stopped responding, and his whining faded out. We came up to the turn to get onto my street, and when I pointed it out, he accelerated and drove right past it, laughing. I laughed in a, "Oh my god, what are you doing?" thinking he was joking around. When I began giving instructions about how to turn around and get back, he began begging me to keep hanging out with him because he was lonely. This immediately set me on high alert. It suddenly hit me that I'm in a man's car, someone I don't know that well who doesn't exercise proper behavior at work, which is in the only context I know him, and now he's displaying weird behavior outside of work as well. My instinct was not to insist I be let out of his car. I felt as if this would escalate, and it could become something bad, and in hindsight, it may have been the right thing to do when I think about the type of person he turned out to be. I told him we could hang out at the park near my house if he wanted to talk, and he seemed to like the idea, and we parked and walked over. The pleasant conversations resumed, and beside the weird clinginess, he was perfectly fine to talk to, until he dumped his entire life story on me, including his prior arrests for theft, his heroin addiction, and related struggles with depression. I tried to be sympathetic, but I was very put off by this. It was a lot of highly personal information all at once, and I was still on high alert because of his prior behavior. I tried changing the subject by showing him pics of my dog. I scrolled one pic too far, and the next one was a photo of me wearing makeup and posting cutely, which is way different than the slob I was at work. He grabbed the phone and went, "Wow, you're very photogenic." I felt awkward and didn't say anything. There was a long silence. Then he launched forward into a weird tangent about how compatible we are and that we have similar interests, etc., etc., and that he wishes I wasn't moving so that I could try hanging out again, but on a date. I didn't say anything, and he broke the silence with, "Sorry I'm saying all this stuff. I'm actually really high right now. That's why I know where Riverside, bad neighborhood that had previously come up in conversation, is. I went there to buy. Otherwise I wouldn't have said it at all. I'm sorry." Internally, I freaked out. He had definitely put his addiction in the past tense, and I assumed it was something he was recovering from, not currently using. I also realized I had been in a car he was operating while under the influence. I don't know anything about heroin, so I was clueless, and I felt very, very stupid. He immediately started whining and begging me not to judge or hate him, and kept saying over and over again how nice I am and how understanding I am, that I'm pretty and smart. All these weird compliments interspersed with talking down about himself. I don't know what to do. So I smiled reassuringly and told him not to worry, but that I was tired and wanted to go home. That's when he began crying. He had this weird, wheezy sob with no tears. I sat there silently while he did this, trying to come up with some sort of graceful escape plan. My patience was wearing thin, and my anxiety was through the roof. It's a weird feeling to be annoyed and panicky at the same time. I stood up and apologized, said the park was close to my house so that I'd walk, and began to leave, when I remembered I'd left my things in his car. Trying a new approach, I casually mentioned that I forgot my stuff in his car, and joked that if he wanted my dirty lunch containers, he could keep them. He ceased his bizarre crying, stood up, ran over to his car to unlock it, and I grabbed my stuff out of his backseat. His demeanor changed drastically, as he calmly apologized for making things weird, and asked if he could drop me off at home so that I didn't have to walk alone at night. I said yes, but made him drop me off a block over my little side street so that he wouldn't know which house was mine. I could end it there, but what bothered me the most about this guy happened after this encounter. A week or two after that weird evening, the end of August by this point, I had my last day on the job and moved 1,000 miles across the country. Warner would sometimes text me long ramblings, detailing his feelings about himself and about our missed opportunity. I didn't respond to these messages. Now that I wasn't near him, I didn't feel the need to placate. The texts stopped after a few weeks, and I forgot about him. Fast forward to February, and I get a text from a former coworker. Her message said, "Sorry you had to hear about it this way," and her next message was a link to a local news article titled, "Man Dies from Wounds in Riverside Stabbing Wednesday." Because of the way she worded it, I thought Warner was the victim. But when I read the article, it included his mugshot and the charges. He was the attacker. He murdered someone. I felt so shocked and disgusted. I couldn't believe I knew someone who killed another human. Later on, I called an old work friend for some details. Apparently, shortly after I left the job, he was fired for trashing the men's bathroom. Just threw around anything he could lift and poured all the soap out and smeared it all over the place. He then lost his apartment. Presumably, some of the articles about the stabbing describe Warner as a homeless man. I have to assume that's how he ended up in the aforementioned Riverside. There are lots of homeless drug addicts who squat in abandoned houses. I wondered if the man he stabbed had refused to give him something that he wanted, and that's how he reacted to a hard no. I don't think I made all the wisest decisions during my interactions with Warner, but I'm glad I was able to avoid setting him off, since he was clearly not stable. Hands down, the worst intern I've ever encountered. Back in January 1995, while driving home on leave, I experienced something straight out of a movie. I was getting ready to be deployed to Gitmo for a joint task force mission, and needed my parents to take care of my 2 kittens I had adopted a few months earlier. The drive home usually takes around 6 to 7 hours, but I didn't mind the drive. Anyone who's ever driven through Texas knows that you can drive for quite a while and not see another car on the road. It's 9 p.m., and I'm 15 minutes outside of Seymour, Texas, heading towards Dallas. The two cats that, for the most part, had taken up residence on my back section by the rear window had been sleeping. It was here that things started to get strange. I noticed about 200 plus meters behind me another vehicle's headlights and thought nothing of it. A few moments later, the cats both started making this moaning noise over and over again. I figured they needed to go to the restroom, so I pulled over in the middle of nowhere with these two cats freezing because it's January and I'm waiting for them to do their business. After about 5 minutes and a cigarette, I opt to put them back in the car and give them a little dry food. I began heading back down the road. 10 minutes go by, and I see headlights again behind me, possibly a little closer than before. Both cats jump up to the rear window and begin making their noises again. It's here where I realized that the car behind me earlier never passed me. But why? It was a while ago when I stopped. I started to slow down in order to let the vehicle overtake, but after going over a hill, the headlights vanished, and no car ever drove by. I went through another small town and stopped to stretch my legs. It would have been around 10 p.m. now, and I wouldn't have much longer to go. I started back on the 2-lane interstate and was moving along around 65 to 70 miles an hour. And sure enough, about 10 minutes out of town, the lights returned. This time I said screw it and stepped on the gas. As I approached the bridge heading into the next town, I blew past a police car. He, of course, turned around and lit me up. I pulled over and rolled down my window, showed him my driver's license, military ID, and badge. He asked me what the hurry was, but seemed distracted while he stood next to my car. He kept looking up at the sky. I told him for the past hour I was being followed, and no matter what I did, the vehicle behind me just kept pace. He let me off with a warning and told me to take a right at the flashing stoplight and cut through town. He said he would stop the next car to come through and check them out, and also mentioned they were receiving multiple claims from nearby residents of weird lights in the sky and noises. I thanked him and did as he suggested, and didn't have another issue for the remainder of my trip home. If anyone has ever experienced anything similar, I would love to hear about it. My grandma's house is chock full of weird stories going way back. Pretty much everything weird and scary has happened in the hallway leading to the spare bedroom. My grandma would see my grandpa's silhouette walking down the hall. He'd stop at the door to their bedroom and peer in, and she'd ask if he needed something. He wouldn't answer and would keep walking. Peeved, she would get up to ask him again, only to find him in the living room sleeping or watching TV and insisting he'd been there the whole time. My mum has heard someone calling her name from the same hall, and once we were there alone house-sitting while my grandparents were out of town. They were due back late that night, and my mum and I both heard heavy footsteps coming from the hall. She told me they must have come home early, and as she went to greet them, she realized there was no one there. The guest room at the end of the same hall has a TV that will turn on by itself. They also had a couple stay there, and neither one was particularly superstitious. The next morning, the husband was unusually quiet. He finally got a chance to talk to my grandma alone, and said very simply, "Someone was watching us last night." He had seen a figure standing in the corner of the room staring at them, and had been so frightened that he'd just closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. When my grandma pressed for details, He kind of shrugged it off and didn't want to talk about it anymore. There's also a middle bedroom between the spare room and my grandparents' room, which we have always just called Tipsy Danger's room, because I used to stay with them so often. I was on my bed once when I heard a thump and then a skittering noise, like something had jumped off the bed and was running across the floor. I thought it was the cat being weird, so I sat up to see what she was doing, only to find that the cat was at the foot of the bed staring intently at the doorway to the hall. I looked around for a bit and was unable to find anything. My father had been dating this girl for a while, and things were going great. She met us a few times and got along great with my sister and I. Eventually, my father asked her to move in with us. She drove 7 hours to move in and brought along her 2 cats. Things were great for the first 2 months, until she couldn't find a job. They had agreed that she would apply for jobs and have one secured for an interview before she moved in. She moved in on July 2nd and still didn't have a job until late January. I, being fresh out of high school with no experience in a job setting, was able to get a job before her. This caused my father to have to cover her car payments and insurance, which set us back financially. Then October came with the discovery of a full year's worth of text messages between her and a friend of hers named Jared, all taking place after my father and her were dating, and all while she was still living in her hometown. These text messages were laced with him coming over and giving her nighttime love-ins and inappropriate pictures. My father confronted her about it, and she denied it, saying we just didn't understand her friendships. My father lets it go, as they hadn't messaged each other in weeks. Small arguments pop up, and she starts sneaking money out of my dad's wallet at night to go buy cigarettes. This may only sound like small amounts, but it was a nightly occurrence. This set us back financially as well. These arguments mainly consisted of her lying about something and not admitting it, or her doing something stupid and not apologizing. Things got worse as Christmas came. My father expressed that he didn't love her anymore. He didn't have any feelings towards her, and that she needed to work to fix the relationship if she wanted to continue. This meant really trying to get a job and not lying about everything. She agreed that she would. I advised him against giving her the option. I was tired of this and wanted her out. She began lying more and more and causing more problems. We believe she started taking some sort of drug, as she would come back from a drive all shaky and spazzing out, spouting nonsense. She came after myself and a friend of mine during one of their arguments, to which my father responded, "Pack your stuff and get out. How dare you go after my kids?" Telling her to get out and leave was a regular occurrence in their fights, but she never took the hint. She was abusive emotionally to everyone in the household, especially my father, reducing him to tears when he found out she had been receiving $1,000 a month from her mother, which would have had us staying up to date on rent payments. We have no idea what she did with the money. No matter the situation, she would try to twist it so that she would be the victim, even calling my father, asking second opinions, the party of persecuting Martha. Nothing is ever her fault, and it's always a misunderstanding. Then she started smoking in the garage. The door from the garage into the house is right across from my bedroom door, which is always open because our cats like sleeping on my bed with me. I have asthma. I woke up coughing and smelling cigarettes multiple times in one night because of her. She drove recklessly with my little sister and I in the car before, and I told my father what happened. When my father confronted her on it, she said that I was over-exaggerating, and that my sister and I, in our "it's too early for this, I'm gonna sleep and listen to my earbuds" state, was stressing her out. A minor thing, but she endangered my sister's and my own cats. We have 2 strictly indoor cats, and her 2 were outdoor cats until they moved here. Her cats have taught mine how to sneak out the house when the front door isn't latched. She constantly leaves the front door open when she comes back in from smoking, and lets my cats get out. We live across the street from a huge lot of desert and where the coyotes roam every night, and she lets them out before. After she finally got a job, she didn't want to contribute her fair share of bills. My father asked her for half her paychecks every 2 weeks, and she claimed she could only give 25% because there are 4 people in the house. My sister and I are only there on the weekends, as we go to school outside of town an hour away and stay with other family during that time. She also apparently wasn't paying her car payments after she got a job, and she got a repossession notice which she hid from my father. Finally, after financially wrecking us, abusing my father emotionally and financially, endangering myself and my sister, doing drugs, taking money, stealing things from our rooms, endangering my cats and many other things, my father gave her 2 weeks to move out. She moved out a few days ago. She originally left her cats but failed to pay my father the $350 she owed him, so he said that we would be taking care of the cats until he got the money. She flipped and burst into the house when I was there alone, saying horrible things about my father and that her babies weren't safe there. When I called her out for not paying the money and everything, she told me that I was sipping the Kool-Aid, and I wish I was joking about this. I finally shut the door to my bedroom and started sobbing, as I couldn't handle this. She came after me by banging on my bedroom door and saying how horrible I was, and slammed the door in my face. I rang my father on FaceTime and opened up my bedroom door, and she bolted into the garage. I followed her while my father screamed at her to give me her key to the house. She ran past me screaming nonsense, went back to the living room, and I finally had had enough with my dad on the phone and let her have it. I was yelling, screaming, cursing, and was mad, and there was nothing for me to lose at this point. I finally told her to get the hell out of my house. She grabbed her cats by the scruff and ran out. I worry for those cats. I loved them dearly, and they became such a huge part of our family. I wish them nothing but comfort and happiness, despite their owner. Me, my wife, and our 2 children were on a trip from point A to point B. We planned to stop the first evening into our trip with a friend of ours who happened to be near our route. Since we would be arriving at about 1 a.m., our friend left the door unlocked so that we could let ourselves in. Now, this wasn't a large city by any means, but out in the sticks near DeKalb, Texas. So we slipped in as quietly as we could, went back to the room that had been set up for us, and proceeded to try and get some sleep. The room was roughly 10 by 10. Mobile home rooms, gotta love them. My daughter, the 4-year-old, was on a pallet of blankets on one side of the room, and my son started off there but got fussy, so my wife picked him up and let him sleep with us on the bed. The bed was pushed up in the corner, all the way, and I was sleeping up against the wall. My wife had the outside, and our son was somewhere in the mix. We closed the door and turned off the light. It's pitch dark. Roughly an hour later, I hear my wife scream that someone's in the room. I open my eyes and see a black figure move towards the door. I wear contacts, so I couldn't distinguish what I saw, only that it appeared to have been a human shape. I leapt from the bed and bear hugged the intruder. The problem was I couldn't get a hold of it. I could feel its body up against mine, but every time I went to bear hug it, my arms went through it. I could see the blackness. I felt the shape up against my body, but couldn't grab it. I was pushed away from whatever it was, and heard my wife scream something about the light. I went from where I thought the light switch was, and felt something clawing and scratching on my upper body. I found the light switch on the wall, and saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, other than the damage from what looked like a tornado had hit our room. My wife was still in bed, scared, witless. My daughter was on one of the open corners of the room, cowering under a blanket, and my infant son was on the floor next to the bed. Being the manly man that I am, I did the most sane thing I've ever done, and that was open the door to the room. A bathroom was right next to our room, you see. Flicked on the light, and no one was in there. I turned on the next light I could find, and no one was there. I checked the front door. It was deadlocked and deadbolted from the inside. You can't leave a house and deadbolt a door from the inside. There were no other sounds, noises, or movement, and I run back to our room and call a friend. Yes, I should have checked physically, but at this point my adrenaline was wearing off, and panic was starting to settle in. Our friend answered and said she was okay, and then she walks down to our room where we take in what happened. My wife has calmed the baby and our daughter down. They're all fine. My wife has blood pouring from her mouth and can barely speak, and has deep scratch marks from her neck to her ears down to her breasts. I have a fat, bloody lip, deep scratch marks on my chest, neck, and back, even though I'd slept in a shirt that night, and I also have what looks like carpet burn on the top of my right foot. The sewing machine table that was in the room had been thrown across near where my daughter was laying. After we calmed down and collected our wits, we started probing what we just went through. I recounted everything you've heard, and my wife said that she heard the door open and a big black cat jump on her chest and began clawing at her. Its face was smushed up against hers, causing her to feel strangled. The cat then started using its paws to strangle her. She gasped out that someone was in the room, which is when I awoke to see a black figure moving across it. While this was going on, our friend heard absolutely nothing. No shouts, no bumping around, nothing. Our friend and most others that we've told the story to thinks that my wife and I were fighting each other in our sleep, which I'm not past believing. She sleeps with her eyes open at times and used to sleepwalk when she was younger, but we don't think this is the case. We've told a few other friends about it, and they've stated they've had similar experiences. Big black cat strangling someone in bed, and another person wakes up to see something, but the something gets away. The next thing that makes me think this wasn't a dream gone bad were my wounds. My wife's healed up fine. It took 2 months for the scratches on my chest, neck, and back to completely go away. The carpet burn, however, took 4 months to heal. We tried medicating ointments and nothing worked. We went to our doctor, but at that point it had began clearing up on its own, and he didn't want to do anything. He made a comment saying that the spot looked like it had been burned. If you've ever seen a 3rd-degree burn, it looks similar. Now, I can believe that my wife can make the scratches, but not what was on my foot. You could make out a slightly visible scar through my hobbit-like foot hair. I am of the persuasion that these events were something spiritual. I was on a road trip with my best friend, traveling through some of the northern states of the US. My friend liked having a plan, and while we did to some extent, she also learned how fun it was to do things my way, which is more spontaneous, like seeing a sign that sounds interesting and following it to see what we could find. We were at the end of our trip, and were trying to get home by the end of the following afternoon, so that she could have her birthday dinner with her family. I was doing most of the driving anyway, so that evening I decided to get a nap in, and then drive through for the rest of the night as she slept. I did, had no problems, and stopped off for another nap midway and got coffee at a dope coffee stand in the middle of nowhere in Oregon that was somehow open at 3 a.m. It was about 5 a.m., and I see a sign from the highway that says, "Historic Covered Bridge, next exit." Sweet! I could use a break and some fresh air, I thought. I get off at the next exit and follow this little road to find the bridge, which is only wide enough for one car at a time. I drive through it, realize I'll have to turn back around at some point, flipped and do a U-turn on the road and drove right back through it, and pulled over into the gravel lot way up the road. My friend was still sleeping, so I just turned the car off, rolled my window down, and left my keys in the engine. I walked down to the bridge and noticed there was one of those info signs, so I was reading it. It mentioned something about early settlers or something. I can't really remember it much, but it also explained the name was Grave Creek, because a girl from a party had died there or been buried there, something like that. I think she got sick and died there, so they named the creek for her. It was super quiet. That early part of the morning where the sun is starting to come up, but everything feels like it's still whispering, like when you're camping and wake up too early. It was peaceful, quiet, and I was enjoying my break of fresh air with a bit of history. I had a rock in my shoe, so I leaned against a little white fence that separated me from the bridge and removed the shoe. Mid-tending to my foot, I happened to look up, and this woman was literally crawling from under the bridge. I kid you not. It felt like my whole body was full of adrenaline, and everything within me was screaming to get the hell out of there. So, for context, I'm a tall and strong woman, always have been, and people don't usually try to do anything to me because I can obviously hold my own. As a result, I hardly ever get intimidated by strangers, and definitely don't get intimidated by other women. But guys, I kid you not. I was terrified and can't even give you a good reason why. This woman who crawled up a muddy hillside from the creek under the bridge was 1. Bald, 2. Immaculately clean from having just crawled under a bridge, and 3. Wearing a strapless sundress. She also had the biggest eyes I've ever seen, and she wouldn't stop smiling. She looked a bit like the Cheshire Cat. I didn't get it. So back to the story. At this point, she's standing about 2 meters away from me. I'm having a full-blown panic attack, like I want to scream and run on the inside, but try to play it cool because I'm like, is she a hiker? Homeless? A druggie? There's too much about her at a first glance that doesn't add up, and I think I was extra anxious because she pretty much snuck up on me. I know my friend is still asleep, and the car is a good way down the road, so I decide to play it cool and panic to myself. Mind you, I had my shoe off too, so my brilliant idea to play it cool was let me put my shoe back on and take off the other one so she doesn't think anything is up. Right? So here I am, now dusting non-existent rocks from my other shoe while she's telling me something about her life story. All I remember her saying is that her mum and her used to come out here all the time, and that now her mum has passed. She asked if I had any money. I lied and said that I used the last of my cash at a gas station a while back, and I told her that I was on the road with my friend and that we were due home today. Finally, I put on my other shoe and say I think I should be getting back to my friend, and calmly and casually make my break for it, and when I think I'm in the clear because she says, bye, she starts to head in the other direction of the road. I'm now at a safe distance, so I turn my back and walk a bit faster to the car, when I hear her voice behind me asking if I can have a cigarette. I turn around to answer her and realized, like in the 10 to 15 seconds that I had my back to her, she had started walking backwards towards me and got very close to me. I double panicked. I tell her no, that neither of us smoke, and she says, oh, that's good, it's bad for your health anyway. And I'm just like, nope, 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 get me out of here. She turns back to the other side of the road, and I get into the car, and have never in my life turned on a car, locked the doors, rolled the windows up, and whipped it into gear faster than I did then. My friend had still been sleeping and woke abruptly at me getting back in. I didn't tell her what was going on, I just started driving, and this chick was stood by the side of the road, grinning her ass off, staring at me. It was the most scared I've ever been in my entire life. As far as I know, she didn't have a weapon or anything like that. But everything about her was unnerving and wrong. My friend dozed back off while I spent the next 2 hours driving. My whole body was trembling. She woke up around 7 and offered to take over, so we swapped. I told her then what happened, and she looked shocked. Apparently she had woken up a bit when she was alone in the car, and looked back and saw me, but didn't realize I was with someone. I would have to ask her because it's been a few years now. I can't remember if she saw the lady as I drove away or if she didn't see her at all. To be fair, her chair was very reclined, and she was sleeping pretty heavily, but was really surprised when she realized how shook up I was, even hours after. All in all, it took me about 5 hours to get calm, and I spent the next year lightweight paranoid that that girl would somehow show up again. I'm actually still kind of scared of it. My mum lives up in Washington, so sometimes I do travel through that area, and I'm just thinking, please, never again. Needless to say, I elect to not drive that much through Oregon, nor see its covered bridges with creepy-ass bald chicks in sundresses beneath them. I own this house down in South Georgia, near a town in the middle of nowhere called Moultrie. It's just a double-wide mobile home that's been seated on a foundation, so it qualifies as a house on the insurance. Anyway, the house itself isn't old. I lived there about 2 years before moving up to Atlanta to take a better job. While I lived there, I smoked often and always outside because I have kids. So from my front yard there was a large clearing across the road. It was overgrown with weeds and the like, but you could sort of tell that a house used to be there. Within weeks of my family moving in, I began to feel freaked out by being out on my front porch at night. During the day, I felt absolutely normal. There was something about the night that just didn't sit well, and I considered myself a believer in the paranormal and maybe a mild clairvoyant. So I felt like I knew that there was something. I was being watched, and so many people described these sort of events. I convinced myself it was nothing though, and simply fixed the issue by smoking up back instead of out front at night. My mum was over one afternoon during a small family grill out, and we were walking around the front lawn, just checking out the garden. The sun was near setting, and you could barely see the light fading over the horizon when she went wide-eyed and stopped talking mid-sentence. I asked her what was wrong, and she just slowly lifts her hands and points in the direction of the aforementioned clearing. It was across the dirt road from my property, and I look towards that direction as I do, and see a dark shadow simply go from what looked like a dog form crouching over to a full bipedal humanoid shape. This thing was 10 feet tall. I mean, huge, if it were human. So I blink and rub my eyes for a second, before asking my mum, "Do you see what I see?" She confirmed by nodding, but is unable to make words. At this point, I'm really getting scared. Now I know that I wasn't mistaken by my feelings of being watched. I tell her we need to go inside. She agrees, so we begin to walk towards my front door slowly. At that moment, my spidey senses go off, and I turn to look back at the thing, as it does what looks like charge across the dirt road towards my lawn. I panic, my mum panics, and suddenly the creature lurches back, as though it ran into an invisible wall. We made it to the porch at that moment, and I have one foot in the door when my mum finally speaks and says, "Wait, it looks like it stopped." When I focus again on the thing, I notice it has no eyes, no defining form, only the dark outline of a shadow overcasting the already dark background of tall grass and the clearing with the surrounding trees. The thing charges forward again, but lurches back at the edge of the lawn. Freaked out, we assume it's paranormal, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we head inside. We tell everyone in there, and of course they think we're messing with them. Eventually everyone goes home, and I discuss it with my wife, who tells me to stop playing around. I wouldn't go out front at night again, and shortly thereafter we moved out into Atlanta. I knew the previous owners personally and contacted their son, my friends, to see if they had ever experienced anything like that. They said no, but strangely they had witnessed angels at the four corners of the lawn before. I'm not Christian, and am barely religious, more of a spiritual thing, so I go along with it since they are and listen carefully. Apparently their dad was a pastor at a church, and in doing so prayed constantly over the land and his family. Now, be it strange or not, the fact that they have claimed to seen angels at the four corners of the lawn, and that I have just witnessed who knows what, attempting to enter the lawn and almost being pushed back to the edge, was unsettling. The story ends anticlimactically, with me simply not going outside at night anymore. At least, not to the front. We move and try to forget it happened. I've since rented the place out to another family, and I haven't heard them say anything about it, though I did request they keep an eye on their kids and not let them go across the road there. I later found out the house that used to be there had a small family that lived in it. The teenager actually went to middle school with me, but I never knew him. He ended his own life 3 years before I moved there, and the house across the street was demolished shortly thereafter. I won't ever cross the street again, and I wouldn't advise anyone else to do it either. "4 years ago, my ex and I decided to take a break from our jobs and pursue a lifelong ambition of mine of getting to know our great country a little better. I really wanted to see more of the States, as I'd never left my home state, and was desperate to see what our country was all about. Since I'd been a little girl, I'd put on a map everywhere I'd wanted to go, and with his help, devised a route that would take roughly 3.5 weeks and make it back, and see a great portion of our country. Anyway, we started the trip and everything was going great. It wasn't until about the 5th day in that our car suffered a puncture. So we did the thing where we undo all the bolts and replace the wheel. Unfortunately, it traveled a little further, and as it turns out, the damage that had been done to the underside of the car was far more extensive than just the wheel. So, at 4 a.m., in a state we didn't know in the middle of nowhere, we had to call for help. The people at the call center let me know that help, due to our remoteness, would take a minimum of 2.5 hours, and told us that we had to get comfortable and to not wait up, and that it could be even longer still, depending on some other factors. They were going to tow us to a garage in a town about 2 hours away, and we would go from there. So, we waited, and we waited, and we waited. The cold night air was battering our face. As you can imagine, after driving for about 6 hours straight, I really didn't want to stay in the car or be sat down, and wanted to enjoy the cold night air despite my frustration. My ex, on the other hand, chose to stay in the vehicle and have a little catnap. I was looking around. It's your standard bit of highway. I looked past the tree line and wanted to make sure there was nothing nearby, as I needed to pee. So I grabbed some tissues from the glove compartment and made my way into the woods. I walked around for around 5 minutes, trying to find a decent spot to do my business. When I finally reached an adequate point, I squatted down, did what I needed to do, and partway through my stream, did I hear something. It sounded like footsteps approaching, leaves and twigs crunching under footfalls. I look around and see nothing. I continue going, and just as I'm wiping and finishing up, I stand up, pull my trousers back on, and look around. The sound seems to be getting closer. Remember the context. It's technically either very late or very early, still dark outside as I had to use my iPhone flashlight just to get there. And apparently, someone is walking in the dark who I can't see with no light source making noise and coming close to me. I know, it didn't sound right. I crouch down, stand perfectly still, and twist my head around frantically trying to listen, while also trying to remain silent. I can't hear anything. I wait a little longer, just to be sure that this person is gone. When I'm fairly confident after a few minutes that the sound must have all been in my head, do I quickly scoot up, dust off my pants, and start making my way at a sprint back towards my vehicle. When it's within seeing range, do I hear it again, but now the running is more pronounced. They run at breakneck speed, and I turn around with my iPhone flashlight in disbelief at who is doing this, and the sound is getting closer, but I can't see anyone. My adrenaline and fight or flight kicks in, and I run at full speed to my vehicle, slam the door, waking up my ex-boyfriend, and we both look into the woods. At the end of the tree line, there's some sort of shadow that flickers and is gone. I look to my boyfriend without saying a word, unsure if I had just seen what I'd seen, and wait for him to say something, to confirm, just to make sure I'm not crazy. Remember, it's quite dark, so it was quite hard to see anyway. But we have our hazard lights on, and by the light of the vehicle, do I just see it for that split second. I say, Did you see something in the forest? He looks at me with wide eyes and says, You saw it too? I ask him what he means, and after a moment's hesitation he says, Like a shadow behind a tree, and then it was gone. I give him a slow nod, and we sit there in silence until the guy comes to tow our car. It was pretty disturbing. Needless to say, I chose to do the drives during the day and not the night after this day. In early 2017, I had just moved to a large city in the southwest US that enjoys a fair amount of violent and property crime. I'm a skinny white male in my mid to late 20s, not exactly a hardened warrior, but I was just trying my best to adjust to this harsh environment. My girlfriend at the time's parents had just bought a house in a quiet neighborhood for her and I to live in. Most of the houses in the area had bars on the windows and doors to prevent burglary. The previous owners had removed the bars from our house prior to selling it, probably because they thought the bars would lower the home's value due to a perception of danger. This meant we were the only houses in the neighborhood with exposed windows and doors. To add to that, the house was on a corner next to a road that led straight to a main road. So in the event of a burglary, the getaway would be rather simple. My ex and I were in the habit of going to a fast food joint every day for lunch before she went to work. We left the house one day and got in the car on our way to get lunch, and I happened to glance over and notice a man standing on the corner across the street. He's moving erratically, as if waiting eagerly, and seems to be staring directly at us. He's Hispanic, mid-20s probably, with a fresh fade haircut, long shorts, and a shirt that's way oversized. The sort of clothes that make you think, maybe this guy is accustomed to doing crimes. I say to my ex, let's not go anywhere. Let's go back in. Once back inside, I explained to her my thought process, that this dude on the corner looks like he's staking the place out for a robbery, waiting for us to leave. My mind starts racing, and I go into emergency freakout mode. I go downstairs into the basement, where a narrow window overlooks the street. I can see the corner where he's standing, and he's no longer there. I see he has crossed the street and is now leaning against a fence diagonal from our house, looking straight at the house. He looks agitated, like he's a little pissed off we haven't left. It looks like he thinks we've just gone in for a second and will be leaving again soon, so he's waiting. I think he must be very stupid to think he's inconspicuous, standing right there looking all antsy. I call the non-emergency police number, and it takes several minutes for them to answer. When they finally pick up, I explain my concern, and to my surprise they take it pretty seriously. She asks for a description, and if he appears to be on drugs. I note that he appears to be on some kind of stimulant, based on his agitated and antsy gestures. The operator tells me they'll send an officer to check him out, and that is the end of the call. I look out the window, and he's gone. Since I feel my house is being actively scoped out for an invasion, and I have several collectible things and adore my cat, I want to do everything I can to prevent that. I go outside, since I'm new to the neighborhood, and suddenly scared, it seems like it's a great time to introduce myself to the neighbors. I see a guy pull up in a truck across the street on the corner where I initially saw the creep. So I walk over towards him. As I'm approaching his truck, I see the creep coming down the street towards me. It appears he had taken a stroll around the block and was looping back. I approached the man exiting his truck and introduced myself. He wasn't the neighbor but some local delivery guy. Crap. I start walking back to my house, and somehow the creep isn't walking very fast behind me. I'm not exactly sure what to do, but I want to show a strong presence of guardianship. I turn on the water hose in the front yard and start watering the bushes. The creep is slowly slinking by on the sidewalk looking at me. I look at him and ask, "How's it going, man?" He stops on the sidewalk directly in front of the house, looks at me and says, "Good." I say, "Just so you know, I'm gonna be here all day." I was working from home at the time, so this was true. "Oh yeah?" he says, and steps into the yard a bit. His body language isn't exactly aggressive. It's just like we're having a normal conversation, which is disturbing to me. The fact that he's so calm and engaging me is unsettling, like he isn't intimidated that I'm calling him out. Since he stepped onto the yard a bit, I sort of point around his feet and say, "That's private property." At that point he appears to take the hint and continues walking down the street. After he's out of sight, I knock on some doors on my block, introduce myself, and explain the situation. I think my instincts definitely kicked in, and any shyness or fear of awkward intrusions was totally demolished by my drive to survive. I met an old lady across the street, weak but potentially helpful as a lookout. I continued down the street and spotted a middle-aged Hispanic man talking with a middle-aged white male guy with a long grey beard. I approached them, introduced myself, and asked them if they noticed a creepy guy walking around. Turns out they did. That is what they were discussing. The Hispanic male, Dan, told me that he knew where the guy lived, and asked if I wanted to get into his truck and drive by his apartment. I agreed, and jumped into his truck, nearly sitting on top of a pistol that was laying on the passenger seat. Yup, he was armed, which was actually a bit of a relief, as I'm not a gun person at all. We drove a few blocks down to the end of the street, and he pointed out what he suspected was the creep's apartment. Sure enough, the creep was leaning against a wall wearing totally different clothes. Being a criminal mastermind, he'd decided to run home and change outfits to not arouse suspicion. He didn't seem to notice us drive by. Dan said that he'd brought his gun in case he felt like scaring the creep. He was a pretty ballsy guy. Apparently he'd seen that guy walking up and down our street earlier in the day. One of the neighbors reported to Dan that the creep was peering into his nephew's truck, which was parked on the street, and Dan had to scare him away, but continued walking up and down the street as if plotting something. We drove back towards our homes, and he dropped me off. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to keep an eye out. During my discussion with the neighbors, I had also met a proactive young man who lived on the street, who also claimed to have seen the creep. We also exchanged numbers. I was beginning to form a sort of neighborhood local watch, and it felt pretty cool, but I was still scared. I'd had some fantasies crossing my mind, like what if this guy was part of a larger gang, and he's just a scout. I felt like me and my girlfriend were in danger, and all the while my ex is in the house getting ready for work. I'm afraid that when she leaves, I'll be home alone, it'll be dark, and this terrifying person will come into the house armed. I continue to pace around, checking the windows every few minutes for any sight of him. I look out the window and he's standing in the street directly in front of the house, looking directly towards us. Oh gosh, he's threatening me. He thought about what I said earlier about this being private property, and he's blatantly testing me. So I call the cops again, explain the situation, and that he's standing right in front of my house in a very aggressive gesture, as a sort of psychological attack. Again, the operator is really understanding, and says that he'll send someone to talk to him. He disappears. I continue pacing the house, looking out the windows, and I see him walk back and forth down the street, seemingly doing more laps of the block. Finally, 2 police show up. I can see through the window that they stopped him a bit down the street and are talking to him. I can also see Dan has stopped his truck nearby and is speaking with him as well. But there was no way I was going out there to speak to them while he was there. I watch. At some point, the creep retreats back to his apartment. They let him go. I guess they didn't have anything on him, as he hadn't broken any laws, so he was free to roam. I walk out to speak with the cops and tell them I'm the one that called and that I don't feel safe. They explained that the guy appeared to be high, said that he had smoked some synthetic weed and that he appeared to be hearing voices. This was kind of a relief, because I thought he was some sort of cunning professional criminal, not a dumbass, but nonetheless I still didn't feel safe. The cops explained they can't do anything unless he's actively trespassing or doing some crime. I'm glad they at least spoke to him, and figured that that would dissuade him from continuing to creep around the block, which it did. I spoke to Dan after the cops left, and he mentioned how the creep was saying, "I want that truck," to the cops. I couldn't believe I didn't realize it before. This whole time I thought he wanted something in my house, but he was really interested in Dan's nephew's red truck parked on the street, which was standing in front of my house. I think he was trying to maintain distance from Dan's house because he has a gun. Even still, my adrenaline glands had been through the ringer that day, and I was pretty much in a state of high tension for the rest of the night. A friend came over to hang out completely out of sympathy so that I wasn't alone and terrified. It might not sound that scary to you, but the feeling that this individual was targeting me, and then the feeling that he was threatening me personally after I engaged him, was highly disturbing. Either way, my vigilance and paranoid nature ended up helping out my neighborhood and strengthening the bonds between the people who lived around me. I got out of the city, and am back in the calm, liberal city where most of the criminals are the people who don't pick up their dog poop at the park and fart in yoga classes. When I was a child, I woke up to footsteps on the roof of my apartment, as I lived on the top floor. It sounded like something was running across the roof. Being a young child, and not really knowing when Christmas was, I ran into my parents' room as they slept, and was excited telling them that Santa and his reindeer were on the roof. They woke up, and told me to go back to sleep as it wasn't anywhere near Christmas. So I go back into my room, and closed the door. I laid in my bed and clearly remembered a tall figure, which was shadowy, and can't remember any more of what happened after what I saw. After the event, all my life I've seen shadow figures. I've had dreams of grey aliens and having medical type experimentations done on me, and have woken up with scars that are perfect incisions that were made overnight and healed completely once I awoke. One time, I was in my grandparents' backyard around 1 or 2 a.m. with my Siberian Husky and ex-girlfriend. We were sitting on a picnic bench just looking at the stars, as I would constantly see stars in space that started moving back and forth, as they were objects in space that were being flown by intelligence and enjoying the nice night. They lived in a rural area with practically no light pollution, and you could see so many stars it was quite beautiful and breathtaking. On this particular night, we were out there with the dog facing the forest, with about 4 acres of my grandparents' yard between us and the forest. We began to hear loud screams that didn't sound like human, fox, nor owl. Not to mention, the closest home was a mile or 2 away, and then all of a sudden my husky started barking at something in the field, and my ex and myself assumed it would be a deer or something like that, as only the dog could see it. The field was big and it was hard to see, so we calmed down the dog and continued to ignore him until he began snarling. I got down to the dog's level and tried to see which area of the field he was looking at, and tried to focus my eyes, and saw a tall figure, and it made this screeching sound that I would constantly hear all the time. Instead of trying to run after it, my dog on a leash tried to run away, so my ex and I bolted inside, as she also saw it. Take it as you will, but when I lived in that house when I was alone, I felt like I was constantly being watched, even when I would walk upstairs and have to run up them, as I felt something was behind me that I couldn't see. I had a dream the other night, a lucid dream mind you, that I was with a guy whom I've never seen, but this guy seemed familiar. He had headphones on listening to music, the big over-ear studio headphones, and he proceeded to take the headphones off and place them in my head, which a folk rock song started to play as clear as day, a song I've never heard in my life, and all of a sudden after I heard the music, the guy morphed into a grey-brown type alien, and my surroundings changed, and all of a sudden I was lying on some medical procedure table inside of a craft, and I instantly awoke and started crying. The alien in my dreams looked all the same with insane detail. Anytime I think about that event, seeing the tall shadow figure behind my door after closing it as a child makes me cry and sends chills throughout my whole body. Thank you for letting me share my stories. They have bothered me my whole life. I haven't shared these events and dreams with anyone except my current girlfriend. I'm 31 years old and figured it was time to share, regardless of what people think of me. I live in Texas and decided to go to Colorado with my then fiance and his sister to visit his mother for a week. We opted to travel after work at about 6:30 and go through New Mexico while traveling at night to maximize our time. I decided to drive first because I enjoy driving at night, and I had time for a quick nap before we took off while my ex finished packing. So we loaded it into the car and took off. At around midnight, we were pretty far into our trip. I was the only one awake, and I had stopped to fill up the gas tank and get a Coke before the craziest part of the driving started. We were supposed to have switched seats at this time, but my ex and his sister were both still snoring, and I figured I could keep going. I drove into the New Mexican darkness for a few hours, until I entered a town called Oscuro, which, by the way, is Spanish for dark. It was about 2:30 a.m. at this point, and as I was driving, I noticed a dead tree off the highway. I was on a few miles ahead, and I made a joke about how dark Oscuro was to myself as I drove close to the tree. It was at this point I saw what looked like a woman's body in a tan slip dress hanging from it. I obviously freaked out, but swore to myself I was just tired and hallucinating, but the entire time I could see the body just hanging. Finally, as I was getting super close, I saw the arm of the woman outstretched and pointing at the road. Her hair was blowing in the wind, covering her face. and I was driving past her like speed would help me stop seeing her. I drove past the trees so quickly and refused to turn my head to see, but I looked in the rearview mirror, and her body had shifted to still be facing the car, and her arm was still pointing towards the road. I was rattled and drove away as fast as I could until I couldn't see her anymore, and stopped at the next gas station to calm myself down and finally to switch drivers. I was so scared that when I woke up my ex, he asked me why I was so pale, as I'm a fairly tan Hispanic person. We went in the gas station, used the restroom, and filled up again. My ex ended up saying he wasn't feeling well, and I offered to drive again, even though I was still very uncomfortable with the idea. His sister refused to wake up when we nudged her, so I was out of luck. The last weird thing that happened that night was while everyone was still sleeping at exactly 3:03 a.m. for 3 minutes. In New Mexico, the road got covered in a fog that was so thick I couldn't see 3 feet in front of me. I was way too spooked not to wake up my passengers this time, but they ended up seeing it as well, and were very confused by how in the desert during a reasonably warm night, there's fog so thick you can't see a body of water nearby for 3 minutes, and it just completely vanished after that. Anyway, I got us to my ex's mum's house and refused to drive the way back, but once again was forced to once the week was up, and this time while passing the same tree there was nothing there. I have no idea how to explain it, and I wouldn't call myself a skeptic, but I also have never seen anything like this before. If anyone has any ideas on what I saw or what she may have been, I would love to hear your take on it. When I was a child, I lived in the Mojave Desert, which is ground zero for a lot of paranormal events, notably Roswell, Area 51, and also just tons of abandoned towns, which makes it all that much creepier. I was living relatively close to Edwards Air Force Base, which was pretty much Area 51 before we knew Area 51 existed. Anyway, in my childhood home, there was never any yelling or fighting. My parents were married and still are, and I was not abused in any way. Initially, I thought what had happened was a result of my parents hitting me for some reason, but I didn't see their faces because they did not have any in this instance. I remember that night so vividly. I didn't know about shadow people until I was around 15-16. Even then, I didn't connect that I had experienced them. I recently clicked a few months ago when I had thought back to the experience. So this one night, I was getting ready for bed, and I was in the bath. I was playing around with the bubbles in the bath and putting it on my head to make a hat. I'm pretty sure I washed it off my head, because I doubt I would go to bed with bubbles on my head. I'd gone to sleep, but awoke, feeling a presence. Like I said before, I thought it was my parents, but these beings had no faces, and were just shadows. I had a nightlight, so I could tell that there was something there. I saw 3 or more of these shadow people moving around the front of my room and talking to each other about me. I don't know what exactly they were saying, but I knew they were speaking because they kept pointing at me and huddled up together as if, okay, what's the plan, y'all? I wasn't afraid of them until shortly after. After looking at them for a hot second, one of them shoots over and puts me in a chokehold while pushing me onto the pillow. I couldn't breathe and was squirming around trying to free myself. While this was going on, I see what you would see if you looked through a kaleidoscope, except instead of looking through it, it's like I fell into it. It reminded me of when you play PS2, and the camera would fall into that abyss of fog when it booted. I thought to myself, that's the last time I put soap on my head. I have never been abused, but I imagine that is what it felt like. I fell into a deep-ass sleep. The morning after, I went up to my mum to tell her about it. At this point, my only experience with anything even slightly paranormal was at the movie Monsters, Inc., so I did not have the vocabulary to say what those beings were. My parents were super conservative and Christian, so they didn't let us find out about all that stuff. The conversation went like this. Mum, I saw Scully last night, and he hurt me. But Scully's a nice monster. He wasn't nice to me. Hella spooky, right? After that, I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, and had several panic attacks. My mom kept giving me Benadryl to make me go to sleep, but that just made me hallucinate, and made me become more afraid to go to sleep. I straight up saw bugs crawling out of the walls. Thanks, Mum. I was convinced that if I went to sleep, I would be attacked again, and this time, I would perish. Eventually, I did fall asleep, and fortunately, nothing has happened to me since then. My band was on tour around 6 months ago when this happened. We were playing at a dive bar that wasn't in a great area of a major city, and in hindsight, should have been a lot smarter about our decisions that night. We had finished playing around midnight, and soon began unloading our gear from the venue to our minivan, which was parked about a half a block away on a street perpendicular to the venues. Said streets were completely empty at this point, which wasn't weird because it was so late. We all packed in the van and began to drive off, but quickly pulled over a block ahead of where we had parked to figure out where we should go in order to get gas for the trip ahead of us. Seconds after stopping, a small white car with 2 men in it pull up next to us. I can't remember what type of car it was, as things became sort of a blur at this point. The man in the passenger seat of the white car began yelling at our drummer, who was driving, and I immediately knew something was very wrong, and yelled at our drummer from the middle seat to lock his door and get driving. He began to drive along the curb to get around the white car, but the white car moved with us, keeping us trapped at that side of the road. I looked at the man and saw him flashing a pistol at the window. My stomach turned. I had never experienced anything like this before. Luckily, our drummer and guitarist, who was sitting shotgun, were quick thinkers. Our drummer put the car in reverse and tore off, pulling around the back of the white car so it couldn't trap us, and we flew into the intersection with the main road. And as we turned ourselves to move forward on this road, I saw the white car turning around and coming to the still empty main road to follow us. We peeled through twists and turns at the direction of our guitarist, who was looking at a map on his phone. The white car still pursuing but losing ground. Finally, we reached a busier street that had some activity on it, and the white car was gone. We had all been sufficiently freaked out, and decided to just get gas on the highway, rather than stay longer than necessary in the city. We spent the next hours going over what had happened and all the naive decisions we had made that left us vulnerable, as the situation left everyone spooked. I tried to bring a little comic relief to the situation by talking about how awesome it was that we won a car chase while driving a minivan full of dudes and gear. What was scariest to me was that I didn't know the intentions of the men in the white car. They were probably just out to rob us, but I'll never know if they were planning anything worse. I also can't imagine what would have happened if they'd have stolen anything from us, leaving us stranded in an unfamiliar city far from home in a shady area. About a week or so ago, I ran across an article online about someone being shot and killed in the same city, mentioning the intersection at which it took place. One of the streets was the street that the venue we had played at was on, and my morbid curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to look up the intersection on Google Maps. It was the exact same spot where we had first been approached by the white car. Most likely this was a coincidence, but it still gave me chills as I think back to what could have happened if we hadn't have escaped. This happened my junior year of high school. One of my best friends invited me to a Halloween party at her house with our school friends and some of her friends from her previous school. When I got there, my friend introduced me to this girl, and we actually hit it off really well. She told me that my friend had told her a lot about me, and they knew each other through their parents' work. We started talking about our interests and were decently flirting with each other. Now, I had gotten out of my first real relationship earlier that year, and I was not one to hop around from girl to girl. So being really flirty with someone on my first time meeting them was not something I was accustomed to doing. At the end of the night, we were sitting on the ground floor of my friend's house and ended up kissing for a little bit, which again was moving really fast for me. We started texting after that, but I kind of had a weird feeling about her and couldn't really see myself being in a relationship with her. But prior to realizing that, we had made plans for a date with my friend, who threw the party, and her boyfriend. When the day of the date came, I had come down with an 101.7 degree fever and felt very, very out of it. I called and explained to her that I was sick and was extremely sorry, but I wouldn't be able to make the date. This was a solid 3 or 4 hours before we were supposed to meet, so I wasn't pulling this last minute. Her response kicked off the most backwards period of my high school life. She responded by saying, "Well, I wasn't going to tell you this early, but I have brain cancer, so I don't have much time to go on dates." The strangest part was she asked me not to tell anyone about it. She stated that this was because her father didn't want her to use the cancer as a way to work people over and get stuff, which I found odd. Now a little backstory. I had a football coach who had passed away of cancer, and my friend's mum, the one who threw the party, also developed cancer around the same time. So the topic of cancer was heavy on my heart, and I felt incredible guilt, and being the emotionally charged person I am, decided to go on the date. During the date, she started saying that she really appreciated me coming and the way that I treated her. This made me feel better knowing that I was helping. At some point near the end of the date, we were walking towards my car when she again brought up that she appreciated the way I treat her. She followed it up by explaining that she wasn't used to guys treating her right because she was assaulted sexually when she was younger and actually had to have an abortion due to a forced pregnancy at the hand of a male relative of hers. My heart broke for her, as she sounded like she had endured a lot of hardship, on top of the fact that she was going to supposedly pass away from cancer next year. I was an emotional wreck following the date, because it was a lot for me to take in, but I knew that if I all of a sudden stopped speaking to her, I would never forgive myself. At this point, I had a small sense of suspicion of one of the things she told me, especially the part about not telling anyone under any circumstances. That, coupled with a couple of things that she had said on our date so far, about 3, regarding what she wanted to do with her future, saying things like, "I want to try out this hairstyle when I get older." After she said these things, she seemed to tense up a bit, but I chalked it up to her coming to terms with the fact that she would be unable to ever do these things. My suspicions grew, and eventually I decided to try and investigate. Her father was a doctor at the place where I went for doctor things, and my personal doctor was a family friend of mine who knew her father as well. I asked her if there was anything I could do to support or help her regarding her cancer. My doctor looked at me and said, "What cancer? She doesn't have cancer." I immediately became filled with anger and messaged her, telling her what I had learned. She told me that just the day before, she had learned that her diagnosis was a mistake, but her tone was very melodramatic and not at all what I would expect in response to finding out you don't have a deadly disease. She tried to cover her tracks and was asking me why I would question her and was saying, "I thought you cared about me." I am livid, blocked her on everything as well as her number, and fall into a pretty deep depression for a few weeks because of how yanked I was about this girl and how this interaction led me to have major trust issues with women, which I still have not gotten over. A few weeks later, I receive a Facebook message request from a name I didn't recognize. It was her. She'd made a fake profile and was telling me I was being so immature and told me she had some explaining to do. I of course didn't answer, and that was the last I heard of her. Until a year and a half later, I had signed up for an ACT retake exam at my local university, and when I got there and sat down, I looked in front of me, and 3 seats to the right, guess who was there? We ended up talking and she apologized for everything that she did in a relatively believable manner, and I forgave her. I never found out if any of the other things she told me about her home life were true, but I made sure to avoid her at all costs, which was pain because she worked at the Cold Stone that was 2 minutes away from my house, and I had to go to the one downtown, which was a pain. I came across her real Facebook profile recently, and she seems to be doing well, which I'm glad to see. But as far as our interactions go, let's not meet again. When my family first moved into our new house in the country, I was happy about finally getting out of our previous home that was haunted. Unfortunately, it wasn't even a week of being there before the activity started in our new house. I still remember the first event that started the whole thing. I was in the house alone while everyone else was outside. I had to run out and ask my mum something, so I went through the kitchen on my way to the back door. The faucet was not running when I went past it on my way out, but as soon as I came in, I found it running full blast. Not just the cold water had been turned on, but the hot one as well. This was an event that happened several times to everyone in the house. Not to mention the dishwasher would start itself in the middle of the night, which us kids were blamed for, of course. That is, of course, until it started right in front of my stepdad and I. He called a repairman to check it out since it happened so frequently at first, but there was nothing wrong with the switch, and the repairman showed us that it was impossible for the thing to start itself. We, as a family, talked about these little events in general conversation from time to time, but there was another event that we were all experiencing that we didn't talk about, because it was the kind of thing that was questionable. I had been seeing what looked like someone walking past the windows of the house from the corner of my eye almost daily, but felt stupid saying something since I never saw it while I was looking at the window. and when I ran out to see who was there, of course there'd be no one. Since no one else had mentioned seeing this, I had the idea that perhaps I was the only one, until we'd been there around 8 months. We were all sitting in the living room watching TV, when I saw someone go by one window. I looked over at the window, and there was nothing there. But just as I got my eye on the window, the figure went past the other window in the room. I immediately noticed, and my mum and stepdad looked over at the window at the same time. I knew right then that they had seen it too. So I asked them if they saw someone going past the window. They and my brother all said yes, and we sprinted out running to see who it was. There was no one. When we came back in, I opened up and told everybody that I had been seeing the thing the whole time. At that point, everyone came out and said they'd been seeing it too, which gave me a huge feeling of relief. At least I wasn't crazy. We had all been seeing it regularly, but were too afraid to say anything for the same reason I didn't. The shadow people we were seeing in the corner of our eyes continued for several years after we moved in, and then it just suddenly stopped out of the blue for a while. My mum told me later, after I was out the house for a while, that she was occasionally seeing it again when I brought it up. It was just another one of those weird things that happened in the house that we all eventually had to get used to. This story was told to me by my family, by a cousin of mine when I was 11 years old. I'm 28 now, but the eeriness of this story still shocks me. In 2001, my 25-year-old cousin Eric was driving from Southern California to a small town in Oregon called Coos Bay to go visit his family. His family used to live in California, but after an unfortunate event of their apartment burning down, they chose to move to Oregon, where they had other family. They moved to seek new beginnings. He chose, however, to continue to reside in California, since he, by that time, had already settled down. He was in a serious relationship with his girlfriend and had 2 small daughters. In this road trip, it was him, his girlfriend Edis, his 2 daughters, and 2 other cousins, Marcelo and Cindy, who were in their early teens. They all packed for the long road trip ahead of them. The usual clothing, shoes, pajamas, as well as hygiene products. They made sure to leave in the early morning and to get a head start from the local traffic. They were all excited to get to Oregon to reunite with family and enjoy the fresh, foggy weather and green scenery. It takes roughly 18 hours from Southern California to get to Coos Bay, Oregon, without stopping except for gas, food, or bathroom breaks. So with so many people along for the ride, they had a few stops along the way, which also made time for some sightseeing in cities like San Francisco, Shasta Mountains, and Eureka. After a long drive without any sleep for Eric, they had finally reached Oregon. By that time, it was very late into the evening, and he was about 2 hours away from his destination, not wanting to stop for rest, and continued driving on a very long and lonely road. All that time of the evening, Oregon weather tends to be very cold and foggy, which makes roads like these more desolate. At the time, his girlfriend Edis and the other 2 cousins were awake because they had slept previously. As Eric was driving, they noticed they were passing by what seemed to be a cemetery. Their surroundings were completely black. The only light besides the headlights of the car was the moonlight that lit up the cemetery and made the tombstones visible from a distance. Then suddenly, his girlfriend spotted what seemed like two people standing near the road. Their first thoughts were maybe that they're hitchhikers, or perhaps they're in need of help, possibly stranded. So Eric opted to pull over as he slowly approached the two individuals and didn't come to a complete stop, the headlights from the cars just barely illuminating them. But he noticed something was off about them. Their clothes were abnormally torn and worn out, more so than your average homeless person, as well as being fashioned from the 40s or 50s. Their skin looked deteriorated and really old, almost as if they had perished already. Out of a tone of fear, his girlfriend told him to keep driving, and that is exactly what he did. He stepped on the gas with tires burning. Everyone in the car was quiet for several seconds, shocked and confused, and they all asked each other what that was. Unsure of what they had witnessed, they continued driving without any stops or breaks, specifically not stopping for anyone on the side of the road, and eventually made it to their destination safe and sound. But that is one event he says he shall never forget. Now, I'm of the Christian faith, so I don't believe it was corpses that rose from the graves or spirits of the dead, but I do believe it was something worse than that. Perhaps demonic spirits roaming around there for whatever reason. You guys can believe as you wish, but one thing is for sure, is that this creepy incident would undoubtedly scare anyone. I lived previously in a small 2-story house with an unfinished basement along a main road. It was a nice brick house with around 0.8 acres in the backyard. The house was built in the mid-40s to 50s and is roughly 60 years old. The past owners of the house died inside it, and what my parents heard from the neighbors is that the husband was part of a cult. But me and my brother experienced a few strange things in the house. The first one was when the basement door slammed like someone was very angry at something, and it awoke my parents. The second one when I was trying to get some sleep, as I had a hard time getting to sleep when I was younger. The hallway light flickered on and off, and then my door creaked open. The third experience was when I was trying to get to sleep, but instead of the door slowly creaking open, it slammed open, and there behind it was a black figure with glowing red eyes, like a ball of pure hatred and evil. Me and my brother have had many experiences with this demon, and ran into it on a regular basis. But the one experience that stands out from the rest is when me and my brother were watching TV in the basement and had a tent set up. Now at the time we had fixed any air leaks in the basement and had no AC down there. But after a while I felt like someone was slapping the small tent me and my brother were in. So I checked it out and saw nothing, and went back to watching TV. Now a while later, the TV signal began to falter. It was like someone was taking this TV signal away from us. But then it suddenly turned black. Not off, black. I tried turning it on and off, and even unplugged and plugged it back in. I even took the TV out of its place on the entertainment system, but it remained black. Then at some point, I set it back in its place and went around to get my parents. But the basement was locked, and it only locked from the basement side of the door. I went back down, and that's when it happened. All of the lights were off. My flashlight, the ceiling lights, everything. Then the lights went on, and then off again. But in that brief flash of light, I saw the dark figure. I shined my flashlight in the direction I saw him last, and there he was. He stepped towards me, and made a full sprint towards the back room, which was still unfinished. I turned the TV off, booked it for the door, and me and my brother ran to our beds. In the house we live in now, I've only seen the black figure a few times. In my window in the property surrounding my house and by the cemetery. That may have been short experiences, but they have nevertheless been very creepy. This story took place in Germany around the year 1997. Back then, my dad and mum were both in their 20s. They were already dating for a while when this story took place. On that evening, my mum, my dad, and my dad's father, so my grandfather, as well as my dad's brother, my uncle, had just watched the new movie Titanic and were heading home at around midnight on an empty country road. All four of them were chatting about the movie and discussing their favorite part, when my father saw something next to the road. It was already pitch black outside, and there were no street lights, so he wasn't sure what he saw, or if he even saw anything at all. He told my grandpa to turn the car around, because he saw something in the ditch next to the road. Because the road was empty, my grandfather turned the car around and headed back to the spot my dad thought he saw something. My dad really did see something. There was a car crashed against a tree in the ditch by the side of the road. What my father had seen were the weak glow of the car's back lights. All of them jumped out and ran over to the car. Inside, they saw someone at the steering wheel slumped over. Before they did anything else, my dad called over to my grandpa and told him to get back in the car and drive to the closest town, which was about 10 minutes away, because at the time none of them had a phone with them. My grandpa did so and drove away. So my dad, mum and uncle went closer to the car and started examining to see if the person behind the steering wheel was still breathing. This person was a 30-year-old male. My uncle was 17 and was just doing his driver's license, so he had just done the first aid course. He checked for a pulse straight away, and there was nothing. The steering wheel had jabbed and crushed the man's rib cage, so he was stuck in the car. There was no way to get him out. After my uncle informed my parents that the man was deceased, they went to the side door and looked to see if there was any information about who the man was. The thing that stuck out the most in the car was the creepy things. The radio was still on, and a quiet tune was still humming. The song was The Long and Winding Roads, written by the Beatles. Up to this day, my mum can't listen to this song without thinking of that night. There was also a bag of bread in the car, which was now scattered around the front part of the car. On the man's lap was a milk carton busted open. The milk was still leaking onto his pants and car seat. My mum, dad, and uncle soon realized there was nothing more they could do. The man was already dead, and my grandpa was already getting help. So they sat there in the middle of the pitch-black night, on the cold grass next to the car with the car radio still on. My parents said that the creepy thing was seeing how fast someone is ripped out their life. 1 minute the man is in his car, drinking milk, listening to music and eating bread. The next, his chest is being crushed by his steering wheel, and he perishes. Please, don't take your life for granted, and make sure the people you love know that you love them. Who knows? That could be the last time you ever see them. Before I go into the nitty-gritty of the story, I do need to share some information for context. One of my brothers had gotten into the drug world, just skimming the surface I'd say, and ended up in jail and recently being released again, traffic fines with some drug possession charges. Needless to say, he knows a fair few users and pushers and has introduced the more respectable ones to some of the family. One of these guys is called Paul. Paul is a fairly harmless guy and has been in and out of clinics in a bid to get control of his life back. His drug of choice, crack. He's had a pretty severe drug habit since he was a teen. When he first met my brother, and while they weren't always friends, they'd recently reconnected when Paul moved back to town to be closer to his family after getting clean again. Like I said, he's nice enough when he's not using, and since most of his family are also drug users, he didn't want to stay with them since he wanted to try and stay clean. So Mum offered to let him stay in the spare bedroom, which isn't that weird since we've had various family friends stay over for months at a time here, so we're fairly used to having people come in and out of our lives. Around that time, a friend who had left town straight out of high school came back for a visit, staying in the next town over. She decided to hold a get-together for a bunch of us, since this was one of those you're gonna be trapped here for life rural areas, so a fair amount of people from school were still here. When we were younger, there was a big rivalry between 3 of the bigger towns in the area, and most of the partygoers were coming from my town. It's changed a lot, but back then there were a lot of fights and tension between the youngs and teens of the town. Of course, I needed a lift out of the town in question because the car was being used, so Paul offered to give one, since he was a friend and was heading out that way anyway. I got the lift, everything worked out well, and the party went off without a hitch, ending at about 1 AM, and as we're adults now, no partying all night. We had a few people who didn't want to leave, but eventually we got to lock up and crash for the night, and all seemed well at about 4 AM. I am a light sleeper, but even if I hadn't been, the banging on the front door probably would have awoken me anyway. My friend rushed out of her room and went to open the door, thinking it might be one of the partygoers returning for something, but I stopped her, and we instead turned on the porch light and peeked through the lounge window to see what was going on. The lounge room juts forward just a bit from the door and has windows facing in towards it, so we could see the area fairly well, especially with the lights on. There was a guy and 2 girls frantically banging on the door. The guy had long, messy hair and really baggy clothes. The 2 girls looked like they were more dressed up to party. One of them in a miniskirt and bra, she seemed to have lost her shirt somewhere, and the other in a short black dress and really tall heels. Neither of us recognized them, though we had a few people come to the party who were friends of friends. The weird thing, and this was the reason it was most suspicious, was that there were no other sounds, as in they weren't calling for us to open the door, or help, or anything, just pounding on the door over and over. That seemed really strange to me, since you'd expect that if they were party guests, they'd be calling out to us by name, or at least trying to explain through the door. I kinda poked my friend into getting the phone and making a call to the cops about 5 minutes later, and then a car's headlights shone on them as I was keeping a watch through the window. They hadn't even noticed me yet, they were just banging. As a vehicle pulled into the driveway, out of the driver's side came Paul. He ducked back and pulled something out, which was a crowbar, then started screaming at them to get the hell out of there or he'd beat them. They definitely took note of that, because they all kind of lurched back and started laughing. It was the first vocal sound they'd made the entire time, after a good 15 minutes of pounding. It was a really weird laughter too, hyena-like and really discordant. I can't really describe it, but it sends chills down my spine, and I watched Paul take a step back when it started. I think that they caught him off guard, and it creeped him out. But he kept yelling at them to move, and they eventually began leaving. Except they didn't run or anything, they just turned and walked off, as if they hadn't just been pounding on someone's door, or had a weird laughing fit. Paul stood there for a while watching them, before coming to the door, and we let him in. He was mumbling about crackheads and junkies, but he seemed very shaken. My friend was still on the phone, waiting for the cops to show up, and when they did, they took our statements and did a sweep of the neighborhood. They said they'd have a car go by every now and then, but that they couldn't really do anything more than that at that point. Paul ended up staying in the spare room, and my friend and I went back to our beds, though I didn't really sleep well for the rest of the night. In the morning, I caught a ride home with Paul, my friend coming along since she wanted to visit another friend, and we chatted about the party and what happened, kind of talking ourselves into thinking it was just a dumb prank by someone's friends. Paul didn't really say much about it and kept quiet for the whole ride back. I never heard anything about it again, and frankly, since it was in another town, didn't care too much about it. Like I said, we'd kind of rewritten it in our minds as some kids having a prank after drinking too much. A bit of a scare, sure, but nothing dangerous. So flash forward to a week ago, when Bro comes back from jail. Paul has since moved out of the house. He'd slipped back into drugs during the time, as my mum is big against any kind of drugs and won't allow them on the property, but returned to town again a few months ago after a clinic stay. Anyway, he and my bro were talking in the play shed. It has a small campfire and is used for hosting visits and playing cards. And I'd come in with popcorn to share when we got talking about dumb stuff that happened at parties. I was telling my brother about the fight we had with the hyena people, and laughing about them when Paul told me that we were very lucky that night for several reasons. Apparently when he was younger he used to run with a group who would invade homes for fun. They'd take their drug of choice, get smashed, pick a house to terrorize, and a few people would open the doors, and when that happened they'd rush in, attack the householder or whoever opened the door, and grab whatever they could and leave. However, they were kind of dumb, smart, paranoid. The lack of talking was because if someone figured out the people, they'd be able to identify the attacker by the sound of their voice. And they decided that no matter what, they wouldn't speak at all during the invasion. They'd just bang over and over again until they got attention. If no one opened up after a while, they'd just walk away to make it seem like it were a prank. And no voice identification meant that no one would get caught since it'd be too dark to see their faces. Paul said he'd gone to see an old buddy that night, and he had had a few friends over. They talked about how dumb they were as kids doing these home invasions and how lucky they'd been that they never got caught or seriously hurt anyone. Some of the younger group that were with them kept pestering about details about the invasions, and some of the others had indulged them. But Paul was busy talking to someone else about something and eventually changed topic. However, just before he left for the night, after some of the others had brought out their drugs and started using, he overheard the blonde guy saying that he wanted to have a go at invasions and they should hit the house of the big party that all the guys from the other town were in, i.e. the house we were staying at. Paul panicked a bit and tried to call the house, but we missed the call. Fearing the worst since the guy was also leaving, he raced over, but not knowing the town very well and having a bit of car trouble, he was scared he'd be late. He said he didn't really want to get his friends into trouble by calling the cops, since drugs were involved, but he was also really worried because he was pretty sure the guy was showing a knife to some of the others at that point. He finally arrived, making it in time to chase the three off the property. Apparently, the day after Paul went to talk to the cops about it, leaving some information out about the drugs, and some arrests were made at that point, but I don't know more beyond that. He said he finally felt enough guilt to talk to the cops about it, after he realized that someone he knew personally could have been hurt, especially when it was someone whose family he owed a lot for helping him out. So yeah, in hindsight, we were pretty lucky that Paul was around to save our hides. Sadly, he's gone out of town again to attend another rehab clinic, as my brother convinced him to do so after he confessed to being on ice. But he did get a homemade chocolate cake out of the deal after I heard the truth. I would be reading or playing with my toys, and as all young children do, I began to reminisce of recent events and conversations. Then, as I remembered something specific that was said, I would literally hear a spoken word or two whispered directly into my ear. It would shock me because I knew I was alone, but what used to scare me was the black shadow man who I would then notice standing there. The second my eyes tried to fixate on and rationalize what I was seeing, it would instantly disappear. He was always wearing a thin, brimmed hat. This all happened in South Florida. I never felt paralyzed, and every time I saw him, I was wide awake in broad daylight. I saw him when I was playing in the living room, and only at one particular house. It was unnerving. I have to start this off by saying that this was not easy for me to write down. I have tried to do it several times over the past few months, but no matter how it came out, it either didn't sound right or I got too emotional with it and lost the facts of how I felt about the situation. This happened in February 2017. At the time, I was 18, my sister was 17, and we were living in a small apartment with our dad, and we were both in high school. She a senior, and me just repeating a class I had failed the year prior. It started off normal, with all three of us heading out at different times to get to work and school. I texted him a little later into the day to ask him a question, and he let me know he was going to the store after work. For context, my dad didn't have a car. He would usually bike or walk everywhere. Today was a walking day since his bike tires needed air. He got out of work at around 4, so I figured that he would be home at around 7, since he was going to the store and all. 8 p.m. rolls around. He's not home. 9, nothing. When it gets to 10, we begin to get worried. We call to no answer, text to no answer, and this continues until midnight, when the police knock on our door. Once inside, the officer explains that my father was killed by a driver who fled the scene afterwards. Everything that happened after that was a blur to me. I really can't remember most of it anymore. My mum comes up to the apartment later on, since she lived a half hour away. At first, she didn't really understand what happened, since neither of us could really explain. One of the officers took her to the side and explained everything. Every time I try to explain the funeral, my emotions get high. So for your sake and mine, I'll leave that part out. Nothing really needs to be said about it. For those of you into the paranormal, there is a minor experience I had a few days afterwards. Of course, as the angsty teen I was at the time, every time he would come up to ask me, "What do you want?" and he would always respond with, $1 million, and hold out his hand as if waiting for it. This was a reference to the song "If I Had $1 Million" by the Bare Naked Ladies. It was playing on the radio during our estate sale. If any of you were wondering if they found the man who murdered my father, he was not under the influence of drugs, alcohol, and he didn't even go to prison. All he had was community service time. There's a reason I can't stand the American justice system. This isn't the first time they've let a murderer go free, and I'm sure it won't be the last either. If you have any questions, I'll be lurking around trying to answer them. Thanks for listening. I really just needed to get this out there. I have a story to share about my ex. We met back in high school by chance. I was sitting in the library one early morning, doodling a little in a notebook, when Tim came up to me. We shared a lot of common interests, and I was deeply impressed by his drawing skills as he sketched a few drawers for me. For the first few years, things were fine. We were great friends and got to know one another very well. He was the oldest of 3 children, and the only boy in his family that was fairly religious. Not the say grace and Hail Mary religious, but definitely the say grace over the meal for 5 minutes in church every Sunday religious. I'm not really religious myself, but I wouldn't call myself an atheist either. But I don't believe whatever it is demand we only talk to him in churches or over our food. Now Tim was a nice guy, and I did develop a crush on him, but I always felt whenever I made a move he would back off and avoid it. So I assumed it would never evolve into anything else. Things, however, changed at the end of my junior year. At the time, my family's visa in the US had been misfiled, and we were told we had 2 options: leave the US for a year and reapply, or fight it and risk being deported for 5. At the same time, my dad had been fired from his job for some BS reason, and my maternal grandmother wasn't doing so well. This in turn affected my mum very badly, because this was her last living parent and she hadn't had a chance to help her father during his last few years. This left her with a lot of guilt and what ifs and could haves that worried her endlessly. At the same time, I was entering my senior year, 3 credits short of graduation early, and my sister was in the 2nd year of college. There was also the fact that the USA was pretty much the only home I had ever known, so it was a question of when and not if. So my dad does the only thing he can think of. He asks some of his co-workers and family friends if they could take my sister and me in for the year, so that I could finish high school at least. The family I ended up living with for the year was absolutely wonderful. They only had 1 son, and we were friends, and they treated me like family from day 1. The mum was Catholic, but she was one of the really great ones that wouldn't preach her faith into others or judge you by it. They had sort of adopted a lot of their son's friends who didn't have a nice home life, and when one of them came out as gay, she just smiled and said to him, "God doesn't make mistakes. You are exactly as you are supposed to be." I started to call them Mum and Dad version 2.0 really fast. I felt they deserved those titles too for everything they helped me with. They took me into their home and let me live with them absolutely free. All they asked for was that I studied hard in school, did a few chores when they asked, and respected their no alcohol and no sex rules. Easy. It was here though that Tim started to show a side that none of us liked. At first it was just minor stuff. He would call almost daily to ask what I was doing and to hang out. And if I said I couldn't because of something, like studying or wanting to spend time with other friends, he would call my other parents to check if it were true. I wasn't new to relationships, but just because I was technically an illegal immigrant in the States at the time, I had so many things on my plate and didn't notice the signs. Things got even more stressful as my other father got prostate cancer and needed help getting to and from the hospital. It did it. So I had to prioritize my school and other family opposed to my boyfriend and friends with other responsibilities. For whatever reason, Tim didn't like that. He started demanding I spend more time with him than whatever I was doing, especially if I were free. I liked his family, they were nice people, but I'm also an introvert, and if I didn't have at least a little bit of solo time, I can't recharge properly. Soon the pressuring started. No, not to sleep together, but to go to church. His church. He kept saying how it was important, and I'd feel great going there and love it, and it was a Christian duty. This was right when the whole Muhammad drawing controversy happened, and I never found comforts in religion, much less the kind where they pressure on Christian duties. I avoided it for a while until I finally got the courage to tell him that I wasn't comfortable with the idea of going to church and giving everything I need to ensure to graduate, as well as my other family's own problems. I didn't feel I had time to add church to this list. You would think it was okay, but not for Tim. He got offended and started demanding that I give a better reason as to why not go. He even went as far as to go to my other mother and talk to her about the idea of us going to church. She thankfully told him that it was my choice, and regardless of his feelings about it, he needed to respect that. Then the creep factor went up a notch. He started showing up uninvited, both at my home and school. He had graduated at the time and was in college, and it was easy for him to get into school grounds since he had gone there too. He would go looking for me all over campus, trying to guess in which class I was in. Both my other parents and even other brother once caught him trying to peek into my room through the blinds to see if I were home, after asking if I really was there or not. My other mother told him that was inappropriate, while my other father told him to never do that again because it was unacceptable. My brother, at first, made a few jokes about him, calling him Ogles for trying to peep in. But after he caught Tim doing it again at 2 a.m. while I was asleep, he told him he was officially going into creeper territory and was going to kick his ass if he didn't stop. I stopped laughing whenever Tim was around. I become more and more reserved to the point where everyone but Tim commented that I didn't seem happy in the relationship at all. And it was also weird because the furthest we ever got to in dating was holding hands. He wouldn't even let me kiss him on the cheek in private. The final straw came when I was over at his place, trying to figure out how to tell him I wanted to go back to being friends, when his mum suddenly said that it was so nice that we were following tradition. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that she and her husband had been high school sweethearts and married right after high school, and that Tim was doing the same. I full-on panicked. We hadn't dated long. We barely did anything that could be called being a couple, and I was heading back to Denmark after I graduated. I was only 18, and nowhere near the age where I felt ready to marry. Not to mention with how conflicted I was feeling about the relationship. I couldn't see this ever working out. I was starting to see that our relationship, as a couple, was more toxic than healthy. The first chance I had, I told him in private that I didn't feel like this was working out. I still wanted to be kind and not embarrass him in front of his family, and I've never felt breakups should be a public display. Tim didn't take it well. He pleaded and begged, saying if I just tried to go to church with him I would see the light, and that it was ruining the family tradition. He tried to argue that if we married we could stay in the States, but I didn't want to marry for a green card. In the end, we both parted in tears and with things unresolved. A few weeks pass in silence, and I focus on school and just recharging. I'm getting ready to graduate and dealing with the reality that my biological parents won't get to see it because of our finances, and try to focus on the positives. that my other family and sister will at least be there to see me walk to fetch my diploma. Then, joy upon joys, my mum wrote to me, saying that she's going to visit for a week to see the graduation. I wanted both of them, but was so thankful that at least one of them would be there. I happily told my friends about it, and we all started talking about who we would give our graduation tickets to. I can't remember how many we had, but I remember I had a few left over after inviting my mum, other parents, and 2 brothers, and one of my friends asked if Tim was coming. I wasn't sure if I wanted him there after what happened, but at the same time, I had been back to his when we were friends. And like an idiot, I reached out and asked if he wanted to come as a friend. Tim became irate, ranting about how I was being so selfish. His anger was so explosive that it shocked me, and he finished it by saying to me, "There are 5 priorities in life: God, family, health, school, and friends, in that order. But you don't seem to get that. Your order is family, friends, school, health, and then God. You need to sort yourself out." At the time, I was way too shocked to react at first. Before I muttered a small, "That's how I see things. They are what matters," before walking away, giving my extra tickets to a classmate who needed them more because he had one of those massive close-knit families. Graduation comes. I receive my diploma with cheers and pride, knowing that a high school diploma doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. To me, it's the proof I need to show I can dedicate my time to learn. I toss my cap, look for it afterwards, and immediately go off to get the real thing. Our school kept them hostage so we could behave during the ceremony and look for our family. When I found them, I can instantly tell something was off. They smile at me, but clearly something's bothering them. I asked them what was wrong, but they tried to brush it off, making an excuse that someone had those stupid annoying horns with them. I didn't believe them, and in the end my mum told me that Tim had showed up. She knew a little about the drama going on and figured he was just there to say congratulations. Spoiler, he wasn't. He said he needed to talk to her about me and how I needed to be saved, that I was going to hell because I wasn't embracing the church or what my womanly duties were meant to be. She asked him what he meant, and he said to obey her future husband. She lost it. I did too when she told me. We weren't engaged, and even if I was, I'm not some dog that's meant to follow orders. In the words of a pastor I once had, God made Eve from Adam's rib, not from his head, for she was not above him, not his foot, for he is not behind him, but his side, for she is his equal, and so that he can place his arms around her to protect her when needed. I'm not religious, but I've always liked this way of explaining Adam and Eve. So to hear that Tim thought I was his to order around made me furious. The last time I spoke with him, I yelled and threatened him, telling him how dare he think he had any right to decide what I deemed important in my life, and that he had another thing coming. He tried to argue that I needed to be saved or whatever, and I just screamed that I didn't need to be saved, I didn't want to be saved, and that I was happy as I was. He stared at me, saying I didn't mean it. I told him I did, and that if he kept pushing it, I didn't want to speak to him again. I told him it was making our friendship unbearable, and if he didn't learn to respect other people's opinions, the next relationship he'd be in wouldn't work either. He got angry and said I was going to hell, in a fit of rage, and I told him that our relationship is hell, and that you've made it that way, to which he immediately left. I lived in the States for a month after that, and we didn't talk. His family tried to plead for me to apologize to Tim for what I had said, but told them that I had meant it because of his constant bullying. After that, I wasn't welcomed at their house anymore, not that I ever wanted to go back. Tim tried to reach out to me again during the years, with some sort of over-religious story, and how I was like the main character. I told him I would like it if we could be friends, but if he was just going to send me more religious texts, he needed to delete my info. We haven't spoken since. He ended up dating a dear friend of mine a few years later, only to mess it up in the exact same way. Ironic, right? My friend had asked if I was okay with them dating, to which I told her honestly that that wasn't for me to decide. Just because he was my ex didn't give me any right to say who he could or couldn't date, but reminded her to not let him bully her about religion, as she had just left the Mormon church. To this day, I think he's still single and trying to find some girl he can save with religion. And while I wish for him to find his special someone someday that meets his needs willing, I will say this: Tim, I'm glad we never met again, and there is now an ocean between us, so I doubt we ever will. I was once in a car accident, in which I was T-boned by a girl not much older than I am, on my passenger side after she ran a stop sign, when I was 18. For the record, it was very dark and the sign was hidden around a bend with trees in the way. Immediately after the collision, I got out of my car and it felt like I was being taken over by a higher power. The front of her car was completely totaled, and I approached her driver's side door and asked if she was okay, but she was completely unresponsive. Without hesitation, I told the guy at the stop sign behind me to call 911. I pulled her out of the car and immediately began chest compressions. To make things even more strange, I said, "Come on, Aaliyah, stay with us, come on, Aaliyah," with every compression before the emergency services arrived and took over. Now, never in my life had I met this woman. Never have I believed in the paranormal. Until we went to the hospital and the doctor came out smiling and thanked me for my efforts. They then said, "Aaliyah would like to thank you too," and guided me to her room. It has forever lived with me, and we actually became friends who go to the same university. I don't think I saved her life, and that it was instead her guardian angel. Really chokes me up. I'm not religious at all. I even have a lump in my throat just typing this up. I think I'm gonna have to text her. I live in this ranch-style house. My bedroom is at the back of the house and has a single picture window that looks out onto the backyard. The window itself is probably 7 to 8 feet off the ground because the entrance to the crawl space was directly below the window. Also, there's this tree in the backyard that's involved. It's 20 feet from my bedroom window. I don't know what kind of tree it is, but it's an evergreen tree, and the bark can be pulled off in stringy bits. I'm around 5'6" tall, and if I'm standing at the base of the tree, the branches closest to the ground would still be over my head. So these branches that were closest to the ground were at least 6 inches off the ground. It happened in 1998, sometime in late August or early September. It was after school started. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and I remember it was on a Sunday. My mum dragged me to church that morning. My friend and I had started talking about religion. It was nothing specific about religion, but we were talking about it in general. After church, my mum and I went out to eat lunch. When I got home, my friend called. We continued our conversation, and I took the cordless phone to my bedroom, and I was pacing back and forth while speaking to them. I take a few steps towards the window, turn, take a few steps towards the opposite wall, and repeat. At one point, I walked down towards the opposite wall, turned to face the window, and that's when I saw this shadow that looked like a person from the neck up. I quickly tried to find something that could have cast a shadow of that shape, but couldn't. Then I realized the shadow had a 3D quality to it, and I audibly said, I suppose it realized I could see it, and it appeared to drop. I ran towards the window in time to see it run across the backyard to the tree. It started to climb the tree. It got to the lowest branches and it stopped. It stopped climbing and looked at me to see if I was watching it. While it was looking at me, it grabbed a few of the branches. It held the branches for a bit and then started climbing again as it vanished. My friend heard me say, "Oh my God," and asked me what was happening. I told him what I'd seen, and he told me to start thinking of God because, according to him, what I had just seen was a demon. A few days later, I go back out into my backyard for another reason. I look at the tree, and it reminded me of what happened. I went over to the tree, and that's when I noticed that the couple of branches this thing had grabbed and was held onto were dead. I could tell these branches specifically were dead because all the needles on these two branches were brown, while all the other needles on the tree were green. A few days after that, all the needles from just those two branches had fallen to the ground and were laying in a pile. Several years later, while working the graveyard shift as a security guard, I gathered up the courage to call this famous late-night radio talk show and told my story. The host asked me if the eyes were glowing red. I told him no, because this thing's eyes weren't glowing at all. He said that in his experience, if the eyes were glowing red, it was a demon. Otherwise, it was something else. For context, I have some drug-addicted neighbors. My front door faces the corner of their house, and I can see part of the front and backyard. One of the wilder memories I have of my neighbor Beth is when her youngest son of 3, Damien, came over and shyly knocked on the door. I was the one to answer, and looked down at him and asked what's up. He looked up at me and asked to borrow my phone. Barely as soon as the words left his mouth, something catches my eye, and I focus over his shoulder to see Frank, the eldest son, fly back and lie on the ground. I hear an angry yell, and Louis, the middle-aged son, rushes out and punches Frank. By now, Mum can hear the fighting and begins to dial 911 and stands next to me to watch. Frank shoves Louis away, and just then Beth runs out and starts shrieking at Frank to stop. He swoops down and gets a brick from the stepping path thrown at her. He misses. Beth stopped screaming and Louis tries to punch Frank again, and then Frank grabs Damien's skateboards and flings it at him. He misses, and the skateboard went through the front window, breaking it. There's more screaming, but then Frank runs back towards the house, snatches Damien's baseball bat, jumps through the broken window and disappears into the house. Both Beth and Louis come over, and we waited for the cops and started hearing repeated shattering noises as things get broken. The police come, and he splits once more, where he hopped the brick wall into my yard and then to the people behind. They eventually caught him on the next block. Once the police confirmed that he was arrested, Damien, Louis and Beth head back inside. Not too long after, Damien comes back over while Louis and Beth were giving their statement. He looks crushed, and what he told me broke my heart. My computer tower, my monitor, my TV, and the Xbox 360 that I had given him for Christmas once I got a PS4 were broken. I couldn't believe it. What a scumbag. Beth told me later that Frank said he did it because Damien had asked us to call the cops. He was also coming down from a bender on cocaine, which explains, well, everything. I was getting ready to turn left onto the on-ramp for a highway around midnight one night, when I watched someone on the off-ramp blow a red light in front of me and T-bone the person who I was waiting on. They were going the opposite direction as me, and I was waiting for them to clear the intersection before turning. And the guy on the off-ramp absolutely creamed this sedan with their truck. The person in the sedan had their head exploded. Literally. It was splattered across the shattered remains of the windshield, and you could see what was left of them through the empty window. It was really bad. I floored it and left the intersection. It was horrifying, and I was probably 5 miles away before I pulled over and what happened sank in. I probably spent a few hours that night just sitting there in my truck shaking. It still settles me when I think about it. Coincidentally enough, I watched the episode of Game of Thrones with Tyrion's trial by combat only 3 days after this happened. I had to then explain to my girlfriend why I suddenly froze and started shaking again. Now looking back, I rate the realism of that scene as 3 out of 10, having seen the real deal. This started 1 year ago, around the beginning of September 2017. I would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises coming from the hallway and seeing strange shadows walk past my open door. As the months went by, they got worse and worse until it happened. September 2018. I was lying on my bed, tossing and turning trying to sleep, with the worst paranoia I've ever experienced. After hours of attempting to fall asleep with no result, I finally decided to go into my mum's room. I slowly climbed out of my bed and grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and began slowly walking out of the room, flicking my head back and forth, scanning my surroundings. It seemed to suffocate me. I walked through my kitchen to get to my mum's room, where the clock read 2:15 a.m. I walked straight into my mum's room just to see my 2 little sisters already hanging up the bed. Now I know that I'm 14, but sometimes being scared makes you feel vulnerable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the lamp illuminating my sister's room and made my decision. I went to Alia's and Olivia's room and jumped in the bed, keeping the lamp on. I hugged the wall and finally managed to obtain slumber. Next thing I remember, I was sitting up in bed staring at the black abyss beyond the open door. I slowly whispered 3 times, "I see you." And after the last syllable left my mouth, I noticed a little glass circle in the palm of my hand. It was all fogged out except one little clear circle. I looked through the hole in the glass, and what I saw burned an image in my mind which I'll never forget. A young boy was standing in the doorway staring at me. He was dressed in an old pioneering outfit with a top hat, his hair long, shaggy and black, his long face pale white. In fact, everything on him was black or white. Everything but his eyes, they were yellow. I immediately put the glass down, and as I did it, it was like he teleported, because the next thing I knew he was crouched right in front of my face and pulled the biggest smile. His teeth, the same color as his eyes. I burst awake, eyes wide open, facing the ceiling. I tried to get out of bed but couldn't. I was terrified. My ears were ringing to the point where I couldn't hear anything else. It was so loud yet so quiet. I felt pressure on my chest like someone was pushing really hard. But that wasn't the worst part. The boy from my dream was standing in my doorway, staring at me. He wasn't even moving. It was enough for me to panic myself into oblivion. I tried to get out of there ASAP, but nothing worked. After what felt like an eternity, everything snapped back into place. No more boy, no more ringing, no more tension. I could move again. After that experience, I immediately noped right into my mum's bed between the kids already there, and finally fell asleep at 3:15 a.m. I have a story about a crazy ex. He told me he loved me on the first blind date. At one point during the date, the topic of kids came up. I forget exactly what he said, but his response was, "Don't you mean our kids?" There were so many red flags, but he was supposed to be the best man at my friend's wedding, and I the maid of honor, and she kept pressuring me to give him a chance. A week later, I told him I was going to class, so my phone was going to be off for the next 2 hours. Afterwards, I turned my phone back on to see I have 10 missed calls and countless texts asking me where I was and why I wasn't picking up. I freaked out and broke up with him over it. My friend called me screaming, telling me I broke his heart and that he was crying his eyes out over me. And I stupidly decided to take this guy back. Around Christmas time, I took him to my friend's Christmas party. Before we left, we exchanged gifts. He gave me an expensive $100 necklace, a giant box of chocolates that was almost as big as me, and I gave him a $25 band shirt from Hot Topic. Other crazy things he did during the course of our 2-week-long relationship. He told my dad when he first met him that he came from a family of heroin addicts and that he liked to drink and do drugs. It was the first time he told me that too. He constantly tried to force himself onto me, even within the presence of others, and tried to sleep with 9 other girls, including my friend, during the 2 weeks he claimed to love me. My friend and I didn't speak for a year after I finished with him for good because she was so mad at me. I was fired as the maid of honor as a result. Don't let people set you up on dates. It doesn't work out most of the time, at least not for me. I was about 6 years old when our washer broke, and we had to go to the laundromat at a little shopping center to do our laundry for a while. I remember it was a warm June afternoon just before dusk, and I was sitting on the back of my mum's car eating some candy when I heard the roar of engines coming down the boulevard in front of me. I could see down the road it was 2 vehicles, a primer-colored red hot and a van racing at top speed, side by side. As they neared the intersection where I was, the road rose ever so slightly, and they were going so fast, both vehicles rose and collided in mid-air. The van kept going, but the car rolled twice fast and hopped onto the 3rd roll, and as the car rose, the guy was coming out ever so much, and his head was chopped clean off when the car landed. The really freaky part is the head rolled into the gutter, about 6 feet directly in front of where I was sitting.